Hi, my name is Alyssa Derezycky. I'm a senior cultural studies major with a concentration in media and popular culture, and today I'm going to be presenting a section of my capstone. So we're going to be looking specifically at abolitionist strategies to use when creating film to get rid of the white gaze in it, and we're going to be using the 2016 film Moonlight by Barry Jenkins as a sort of case study for how that can be done optimally. So to provide some context for why I decided to write about this, I'm going to turn to a quote from Bell Hooks from the introduction of her book Race and Representation. She writes that film is so central because it, more than any other media experience, determines how Blackness and Black people are seen and how other groups will respond to us based on their relation to these constructed and consumed images. So in here we have a firm belief that film is a very powerful cultural tool in our society. So I think it's very important that we use it wisely, and encoding the white gaze into your film is not a wise use of it because it's affirming white hegemony and all the consequences that that has on people of color in our society. So with an understanding of that cultural power, I wanted to look at how this tool could be used to combat it. We're also in a moment where Hollywood is entirely obsessed with diversity. It's such a buzzword, but I fear that we're using it in a shallow way where it's more so a box you check if you have a person or people of color in your film, instead of thinking about, not just what we're seeing in terms of people of color, but like how we're seeing them. That's what I want to explore, is essentially the how. There are actually plenty of pre-existing texts on the white gaze, things that really look in depth about what it is, why it's there, and how it affects people. But what's missing a lot is how we can make film that combats it, specific strategies that people can use to make better stories. And that's something that really mattered to me as someone who aspires to be a filmmaker. So my goal here was to provide paths for filmmakers to walk along to get towards that balancing of cultural power. So before we embark on abolishing the white gaze through different strategies, what we need to focus on is what the white gaze is. And that entails looking at whiteness, which is where we're going to begin. I believe that whiteness in this country developed in two phases. So to understand the first phase of whiteness, we're going to look at the Marxist concept of ruling class and ruling ideas. In every historical epoch or era, there is a ruling class, and this ruling class is determined by who controls the material forces in that society. That is, who controls the means of making money. And the ruling ideas are the ideas of this main group that often justify their means for making money. So when we look at the inception of this country and the dynamics that existed, slavery was the material force. It was people's unpaid, abusive labor that funded this country. And the ruling class were the colonizers that came over and made this happen. So they were the ruling class, and slavery was the material forces. We then see the ruling idea being the racial hierarchy, where white is at the top and Black and brown are at the bottom, because that justifies the labor that Black folks and Native Americans had to put in during that time. So we have this racial hierarchy as a ruling idea, and then this idea structures society and institutions. And this carries all the way forward until the end of the civil rights era, when we get rid of Jim Crow laws and segregation. Phase two begins when the civil rights movement is over and overt racism, overt segregation is ruled unconstitutional. In his book, Black Marxism, Cedric Ray Robinson wrote, "The accommodation of Western historical consciousness to racial ideologies created a particular chain of social misperceptions and historical distortions that endured to the present century." This quote sums up what happens in the second phase. These ideologies become so deeply ingrained in American psyche that it continues to structure our society, even if law or policy doesn't overtly enforce it anymore. Because of this, whiteness becomes this sort of covert, invisible norm. It's not as apparent, but it's definitely still there, and it certainly continues to gain the privileges that it was created to garner. There are a plethora of economic consequences for people of color when whiteness is this invisible, powerful norm. But there are also social consequences, and I believe that those social consequences are what frames the white gaze in film the most. So let's look at what those social consequences are. First, we're going to turn to the work of Toni Morrison, the late and great, her book, The Origin of Others, in which she comes up with this concept, or explores this concept of othering. In a white supremacist society where whiteness is centered and normal, everything that deviates from it racially is othered. And Morrison states that othering is a divisive tactic utilized to judge those not in our clan as the enemy, as the vulnerable and the deficient needing control. We see how this plays into racial dynamics, thinking of whites as human and other people as subhuman, and so whites need to control them. That is still an ideology that functions through our society today. From the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, we also have the idea of essentially, it comes from his essay, What is this Black in Black Popular Culture? So under essentializing, it is what deviates from whiteness that is essentialized. And to be essentialized means that your entire identity is totalized by that thing. You don't have any character outside of it. You are just a Black person. Under essentialism, Black becomes a matter of Black or X, X being any other identifier that one could constitute themselves as. And this is instead of it being Black and X, meaning we include the complexity of Black identity. In Stuart Hall's essay, he uses the example of being Black and British. When you are essentialized racially, that's impossible. You are Black or British because Black is the main identifier and it totalizes who you are as a person. This idea of mutually opposed either ors is really prevalent in critical race theory, dating all the way back to W.E.B. Du Bois. In his essay, The Conservation of Races, he asks questions such as, can I be an American and a Negro? Is it possible to be both? Now that we understand whiteness, how it came to be, and what its effects are on others, we can understand how the white gaze came to be. The white gaze is essentially understanding the impact of whiteness, as we just discussed, in the context of film. I like to think about whiteness as a bottle that white people are inside, and it distorts the way that they see the world outside of it. Those distortions are the othering and essentializing that we previously discussed. So think about the white gaze as taking the glass from that bottle and making a camera lens out of it, and then making film through that. With all that in mind, I came up with a definition for the white gaze, which is as follows. That which looks from a perspective that assumes whiteness is central and normal, and that all difference deviates from it. A gaze through which everything is understood in its relation to whiteness as an established norm. And with that definition, we can move on to how it can be abolished. There are two territories in which we can pursue the abolition of the white gaze. Both are provided by Stuart Hall in his media theory essay, Encoding and Decoding. According to Hall, encoding is the creation of film. It's the insertion of meaning into the product. Decoding is the consumption of film and the meaning that people take from the product. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the encoding side because that is where strategies that filmmakers can use live. According to Hall, in encoding, media is encoded with sign vehicles, that is, signals that have intended messages ingrained in them, and this certainly includes gaze. So this begs the question, how can we encode to abolish the white gaze in film? And this brings us to the encoding methods I've come up with. The two methods I've come up with to encode the abolition of the white gaze are as follows. 1, making whiteness visible, that is making one aware of the lens in which they are seeing through. And 2, refusing whiteness as a norm, meaning to show life through a different lens. So let's explore option 1, making whiteness visible. Jean Paul Sartre, a philosopher and definitely an ally for the Black community, and Black Orpheus wrote the following. For thousands of years, the white man has enjoyed the privilege of seeing without being seen. This method seeks to do away with that privilege by showing whiteness as much as possible. This entails that we show whiteness as a race, not the point from which race deviates. That also includes showing the origins of whiteness, that is the first phase that we talked about earlier on, because white privilege becomes undeniable in doing so. White gaze would be unable to function if its claims to universality and normativity were denied and disproven, which is what showing the history of whiteness would do. I personally believe that this is a great task for white creators. However, for people of color, we can turn our attention to number 2, refusing whiteness as a norm. This entails encoding an alternative normativity. That means representing our own normal. And in doing so, othering becomes impossible because we're not describing ourselves in our relation to whiteness. In What is This Black and Black Popular Culture, Stuart Hall writes that what we now need is to recognize the other kinds of difference that place, position, and locate Black people. Later adding that it is to the diversity and not the homogeneity of the Black experience that we must now give our undivided creative attention. He wrote this as a remedy to the essentializing that we saw before, basically saying that we need to not simplify ourselves. We need to show our complex universes that we all exist in. In short, the goal of encoding alternative normativity is to show anti-essentialist representations of Blackness or other people of color. This second method was employed beautifully by Barry Jenkins in his 2016 film Moonlight. And for the rest of this presentation, we're going to be analyzing this film through the way in which he does so. Here I have the trailer of the film. If you've already seen the film or the trailer, feel free to skip ahead, but I'm going to play that for you now.
What you looking at me like that for? What, man? Come on, you just drove down here? Yeah. Who is you, Sharon? For a long time, try not to remember. Try to forget all those times.
At some point, you gotta decide for yourself who you're gonna be. Can't let nobody make that decision for you.
telling why the other boys kick his ass all the time.
What's wrong?
I'm good.
No, I done seen good. And you ain't it.
Remember the last time I saw you?
You're my only. I'm your only. No. You gon' listen.
To who, Ma? Huh? To you?
Who is you, man? I ain't seen you in like a decade. It's not what I expected. What did you expect?
So to elaborate on the film for those who haven't seen it, it is set in Liberty City, Miami, and follows the lead character Chiron throughout 3 phases of his life. First as Little in his childhood, then as Chiron in his adolescence, and finally Black in his adulthood. Little and Black are nicknamed, Chiron is his actual name. Through glimpses of his life at these stages, we watch Chiron deal with an unstable home environment, a lack of guidance, and the fact that he is queer. Barry Jenkins adapted the film from the unpublished play In Moonlight Black Boys Look Blue by Terrell Alvin McCraney. And McCraney actually based this story off of his upbringing in Liberty City with a mother addicted to drugs and exploring his own sexuality. Barry Jenkins and Terrell Alvin McCraney actually share a lot in common, as Jenkins too grew up in Liberty City with a mother addicted to drugs. It's also interesting to note that every character in this film is Black. So Moonlight did win the Oscar in 2017, but it also had a lot of critical acclaim outside of that. Hilton Als wrote that by avoiding the overblown cliches so often used to represent Black American life in film, Barry Jenkins has created something achingly alive. J. Ken Stuckey wrote that Moonlight looks at its subjects as real people rather than social problems. And Michael Boyes Gillespie writes that the film shatters any expectations of essential Black subjectivity, which is exactly why I wanted to look at it. In analyzing Moonlight, I noticed 3 main ways in which Barry Jenkins encodes the film with this non-essential Black subject, and they are as follows. 1 is cinematic strategy, 2 is the narrative, and 3 is symbolism. Let's start by taking a look at cinematic strategy. Barry Jenkins uses audio to encode anti-essentialist Black subjectivity. Jenkins uses sound throughout the film to reflect the emotional state of Chiron. For example, the film will go silent in times that Chiron is distressed. For example, when he's being screamed at by his mother, who is clearly on drugs. We also hear the film get loud when Little is afraid, such as when he's being chased by bullies into an abandoned house. There are also times throughout the film when the audio becomes unsynced with the visuals, when Chiron becomes overwhelmed. An example being here, when his mother confronts him. Hi.
Chiron! Hey!
Hey, Ma.
Hey, baby. Where'd you go last night?
What? Why?
Well, I'm your mama, ain't I? Why you ain't just come home later, boy? You had me worried about you. I guess you getting grown. I can't be keeping up with you all the time. Anyway, baby, how Teresa doing, huh?
It is clear in Ashton Sanders, who plays Chiron in this scene's performance, that he is very overwhelmed by being presented with his mother in this way, and as such, we feel that overwhelmingness through the unsynced audio. Finally, Jenkins uses scoring throughout the film at Chiron's most formative moments, an example being one of the film's most famous scenes in which Juan teaches Little how to swim, which we are also going to watch here.
Give me your head. Hey, let your head rest in my hand. Relax. I got you, I promise. I'm not gonna let you go. Hey, man, I got you. There you go. 10 seconds. See that right there? You're in the middle of the world, man.
What we just saw in this scene is clearly a formative moment for Little because it involves him trusting an adult, which he was unable to do because of his mother's drug problems and the absence of his father, and also because he's learning to trust himself by floating in the water, letting go of the tension that he carries with him all the time. So all of these uses of sound give us the same emotional experience that Chiron is having in the film, and seeing him experience such a range of emotions denies his essentialism. Cinematic strategy is also used in this film through cinematography, specifically filming from character point of view and looking into the eyes of other characters. Angela Florina Laurenne, who is a writer for the New York Times, did an interview with Barry Jenkins in which she brought up this idea that looking into the eyes of his characters has become a sort of signature throughout his work. And about this, she wrote that, "For non-Black audience members, it might be the first time they've had a Black person direct such a gaze their way. Jenkins offers a glimpse at a world previously hidden to them. For a Black viewer, there's more likely a kind of recognition. I know that face, although I've never seen this actor before." So by looking at the characters in the eyes, we are forced to confront their feelings and be present with them and what they're experiencing. And then in this way, the line that we heard in the last scene with Juan and Little in the ocean, in which he says, "Feel that right there? You're in the middle of the world," is the experience that we're having with the character throughout it. He is the center of our world for the duration of the film. Moving on to Jenkins' next tactic, narrative. Characters are written in Moonlight to deny their essentialism, and so seeing these characters as non-complex beings becomes impossible. When giving an example of the effects of essentialism, Stuart Hall wrote the following: "To put it crudely, certain ways in which Black men continue to live out their counter-identities as Black masculinities and replay those fantasies for Black masculinities in the theaters of popular culture are, when viewed from along other axes of difference, the very masculine identities that are oppressive to women, that claim visibility for their hardness only at the expense of the vulnerability of Black women and the feminization of Black gay men." Moonlight is uncannily a response to this quote, as it shows a Black man who is working to balance his masculinity, his sexuality, and his emotions. In this sense, he is not at all simplified. We get to see his complexities without his over-feminization. And other characters are certainly constructed in the same way throughout the film. For example, Chiron's mother, Paula, who we meet as a Black mom addicted to crack, which is definitely a trope that has existed in popular culture. But in Moonlight, we get to see her grow to grapple with her past, addressing the ways in which she wasn't there for her son and how she could have done better, and assuring that she has love for him. This rounds out her character in a way that wouldn't happen if she were to be written as an essentialist character. Jenkins takes the anti-essentialism of his character so seriously that even the bully of the film, Terrell, is seen as a complex being. In the clip we're about to watch, Chiron is confronting Terrell after he orchestrated a situation in which Kevin, a boy that Chiron recently had a sexual experience with, to beat him up. So this is in a sense Chiron's revenge scene. Even in the case of the film's bully, who we are definitely not rooting for, Jenkins still denies the ability to essentialize him, showing him vulnerable, shaking, and fetal position on the ground so that we cannot help but empathize with him. Finally, Jenkins uses the three-act structure of this film to build complexity to Chiron's character so that he cannot be simplified or essentialized when we meet him kind of looking like a pragmatic Black man with a chain and the grill in at the end. Instead, when we see this Black man that we're so familiar with seeing in popular culture, we're reminded of where he came from and the personal experiences that he went through in the other acts that made him the person he is today. It's clear that Jenkins did this intentionally because the third act, when we're about to meet Black, begins with a dream of himself as Little. And finally, symbolism. What I'm going to ask you to do is rewatch the trailer, but this time note every single time that you see blue appear in it.
What you looking at me like that for? What, man? Come on, you just drove down here? Yeah.
Who is you, Chiron?
For a long time, try not to remember. Try to forget all those times.
At some point, you gotta decide for yourself who you're gonna be. Can't let nobody make that decision for you.
You gonna tell him why the other boys kick his ass all the time?
What's wrong?
I'm good.
No. I ain't saying good. And you ain't it.
Remember the last time I saw you?
You're my only. I'm your only. No. You gonna listen.
To who, Ma? Huh? To you?
Who
is you, man? I ain't seen you in like a decade. It's not what I expected.
What did you expect?
As you can see in this trailer, blue is extremely present in the film, whether it be the set, the lighting, the costume, or even the text superimposed onto it. Blue is also in the line that the film gets its name from, which we're going to see in Juan's monologue here.
I was a wild little shorty, man. Just like you. Running around with no shoes on, the moon was out. This one time, I run by this old lady. I was running, hollering, cutting a fool, boy. This old lady, she stopped me. She said, running around, catching aboard that light. In moonlight, black boys look blue. You blue. That's why I gonna call you. Blue.
So from both the trailer and Juan's monologue, it's very clear that blue is very important thematically in the film. And to understand this, we're going to look back to Hall's explanation of essentialism and what is this black in black popular culture. To recap, essentialism implies that you see blackness as something that has to exist with mutually opposed either-ors, meaning that you cannot be black and something else. You have to be black or something else. Black totalizes your identity. But when you look at when blue appears in Moonlight, we see that it occurs at times when the essentialism of the characters are actually being denied. It's in those moments of Anne that blue is actually most prevalent. For example, when Juan is on the beach with Little and we see blue bins behind him and a blue sky above him and the blue water off to the side. In this scene, we are seeing a black man as nurturing instead of an absentee father as stereotypical blackness goes. We'll see Paula, Chiron's mother, in a beautiful blue shirt when she apologizes to her son for the ways in which she was not present in his childhood. Finally, we see Kevin, who is the only person Chiron has ever shared a sexually intimate experience with, in a blue shirt as he holds Chiron at the end of the film. In that scene, he too nurtures Chiron, providing him with the intimacy he's been in long need of. These are just a few examples throughout the film of when blue overlaps with anti-essentialist representations of blackness in the film. And because of this, we can see Juan's line, in Moonlight, black boys look blue, as a sort of thesis for the film, with blue being this anti-essentialist symbol. In Moonlight, black boys do look blue. And this brings us to our conclusion. Barry Jenkins once stated that because he, Chiron, and Terrell Alvin McCraney are black, the blackness of the film is inherent to it, so we didn't need to insert it in any way. This is something that creators of color can definitely keep in mind when they're encoding their own normal. It is your norm, and your racial difference is inherent to you, so all you need to do is create through it. Though Jenkins clearly used the tactics of cinematic strategy, narrative, and symbolism very carefully, he only used them as tools to express what was already inside of him, his experience as innately black and complex as all humans are. And this is what I hope creators of color, or really any filmmaker, can take away from this. We need to understand that our racial difference is inherent to ourselves and unspokenly influential in everything that we do. For creators of color, making film that represents your normal automatically makes it this unessentialized entity. In showing our normals, we represent our race outside of its relation to whiteness, and in doing so, the white gaze cannot function. In short, making work that is encoded to abolish the white gaze in film works towards achieving that true diversity that it takes into account not just the what, but the how. And in doing so, we get a chance at balancing the cultural power of racial representation in film. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation, and if you're at all curious about what goes on in the decoding side of film under the white gaze, you can access my capstone in the Columbia College Chicago Library archives. Thank you.